name's John. My current heart rate is 112. This is a topic that I've spoken about before, but it never gets easier. So I'm going to start off with a portion about my mom, because it always makes me feel a little bit better. You can see this is my family on the screen. I'm the itty-bitty little one on my mom's lap. My mom was a rebel rouser when she grew up, and she was always getting in trouble. And you have to be such a badass to go fuck with the Chinese army. And she just did that all the time. And eventually, when she was 9, they moved to Ho Chi Minh City, and it had a very regimented, structured lifestyle, and that just wasn't for her. She got in touch with a convent in Raleigh, North Carolina, and they agreed to bring her to the United States if she became a nun. And at the same time, my dad was having his little origin story. Back in Taiwan, he was growing up in really an impoverished family, in a family where they relied on government assistance to really stay afloat in a lot of ways, nutritionally, the food, and so forth. And they took a bet that he would be the one who was smart enough to get into a U.S. university and bring the rest of the family there. So he grew up with this enormous pressure on his shoulder to be great, to have the future of his family riding on him. He ended up getting into university and meeting my mom at Texas A&M, and they fell in love. They started a whole life together, and eventually they had 4 children, myself included, and it brought them into their version of the American dream. That's what they were pursuing this entire time, and they wanted to bring us into a world that was better than the world that they were brought into. And my dad, I don't know if your family does this too, but my dad casually drops like horrifying stories. He'll just all of a sudden be like, yeah, well, you know, these guys would wait for me after work in San Antonio and then just beat me up. I was like, okay, great, Dad. My life is a lot easier. I get that. So that's the kind of stuff they wanted us to avoid. And that then started falling apart when I was 8, though. I remember watching this movie Street Fighter with my dad. I was just so into Kung Fu. I know, like Jean-Claude Van Damme, he's like a whitey, but that's fine. And after it was over, I ran upstairs to my mom's room, like my parents' room, to go find her and tell her all about every little detail in the movie. What ended up happening, though, is I found her in the bathroom face down in the garbage can. And I was 8, didn't know what to do, and just started shaking her. And I was like, Mom, trying to wake her up. And eventually I called for my dad. He didn't even believe what was happening. He came up, and we called an ambulance. They took her to the hospital, and the doctors called it on December 1st, 1997. And everything started unraveling then, and in the years following, I realized that the good cop, bad cop thing that parents do is totally a real thing. And for his only son, my dad was primarily a bad cop. Not a bad person, but bad cop. It was especially hard for him raising me alone because he had these ideals of what his only son should do, what should be. And having gone through so much on his own, I think that there was this expectation that I would be better than he was, now given the opportunity of this American dream that he had provided. It was hard when he learned that I have a mental disability. It was hard for him to learn that his son was not strong in that way, per se, and there's a huge taboo and a stigma around it. So when I apply for jobs, I check the box, yes, I have a disability. I check the box that essentially says, yeah, I know, I am not my dad's ideal son. I'm not the ideal description. And I check the box that says, yes, I live with bipolar disorder. And if you're unfamiliar with bipolar disorder, my favorite therapist of all time, she described it kind of like this. If we assume that human emotion can exist from a scale from 0 to 10, most people navigate between like a 3 and a 7. On like their best day, they're a 7. On their worst day, they're a 3. And like a 10 is like when LeBron won his first ring. Like, that's the great feeling. And a 0 is like a little boy who just lost his mom. It's rock bottom. So bipolar disorder, especially given its name, bounces back and forth between a 0 and a 10, a 0 and a 10, unless it's well-maintained and well-managed, and then we can exist in a 3 to a 7. And one of the main characteristics of bipolar disorder is something called mania, and it happens in manic episodes. So for weeks, if not months at a time, I'm bouncing between a 0 and a 10 when this happens, and the 10 is often characterized by risky sexual behavior, delusions, poor financial habits, things like that. So I remember one time when I was like in middle school, I legitimately thought I could fly, and I jumped out of my second-story bedroom window, and that was the 10 for me. And it is always coupled with a 0, and which lasts for weeks and weeks and weeks. So soon after my mom passed away, I went back to school, which like should do. And the administration just noticed that I was kind of all over the place, and they recommended to my family that I see a therapist. And they got a very stern, there's nothing wrong with my son, from my dad. Even a couple years later, they sent me home because I was cutting designs into my hand. I got sent home, and my dad gave me the back of his hand, and he just told me to never do it again. So I started doing it in places where no one would see. And that just continued for a while. This just kept happening, and I kept leaning into it. I was an overachiever in school, so I was like, let's just hit that 10 and stay at that 10 for as long as possible until 1 week before my 18th birthday, I was at my best friend's house party, and her dad caught me injuring in their bathroom. So he drove me to the hospital, and I found out that because for 1 more week I was still a minor, I could only be released by my legal guardian, my dad. Felt like forever waiting. I know they made the phone call. I was like, should I give them the wrong number? I don't know what to do. Like, I'd rather just like be here forever. So I waited, and it felt like forever until finally they drew back the hospital curtain, and my dad saw me handcuffed to the gurney. Of course, because they thought I was a danger to myself. And just imagine what was going through his head, that all of these ideals, all of these expectations for his only son, and just shattered. And he only said one thing to me that entire night, and he just told me that my mom would have been ashamed. So we went home, and he went to his room. I rummaged around for just around the house, and I found a big bottle of Advil, and I ate it all. And that was the night I tried to kill myself, because my good cop wasn't there, and I had imagined that my good cop could never be ashamed of me. So my whole world at that point had generally just fallen apart. Obviously, I failed. I'm here. And I spent the next couple months in inpatient and outpatient therapy just trying to figure out what this whole mental health thing was, because there's such a intrinsically painful and obscure way to grow up in the United States, let alone being an immigrant or being the son of an immigrant or having a mental illness while growing up. And that's why I started speaking about this. About 1.5 years ago, I wanted to just start opening up dialogues with friends, and I was like, you know what? So I don't know if you know this, but I live with bipolar disorder. Hi, I'm John. That's one of the things that I wanted to bring to the stage and also to bring to all of you in the way that you think about mental illness and mental health, and specifically bipolar disorder and self-injury, because those are the unique parts of my story. We are at a record high of suicides as well. We are increasing the quantity of teenagers who are self-injuring year over year. We're kind of in the screwed up world right now, and I don't have a solution, but I'm trying to use my voice in the best way that I know how. So I just want to end with one other thought, and that's my dad actually isn't the antagonist in the story. He has been presented that way so far. He is just the protagonist with a 30-year arc. So ever since I started speaking publicly about this, I started sharing on Facebook. You know, on Facebook you can decide whether it's public or friends or just some friends. I was like, oh God, I should just do this public. So I did it publicly, and like a few weeks later, I got word from my cousin that my dad knows. And I was like, uh-oh. So I went home back to Chicago for the first time since he found out, and he sent me this email. He's like, Jonathan, I'm picking up from the airport. And I replied back, I'm good. But he really insisted, so I got in the car, so nervous again, felt like a little kid all over, and for one, I mean, yeah, and I have like a really weird relationship with my dad, but for one of the few times, he told me that he's proud of me. And it's so interesting because in my head, I had thought of the ideal that he had in his head about this all, but his rationale and his explanation was that when he was a kid and growing up, he had to take these major risks to pursue that American dream. He had to take so many risks to get our family to where they were, and he was just so proud that I was taking my own kind of risks. And to me, that really transformed everything, and he really is the protagonist in my story. And I am here now because also, like my mom, I'm trying to be a badass rebel rouser. So thank you for listening.